For years, people asked the same question over and over. How did this family live like that for so long without the state stepping in? The Whitakers weren't hidden. They weren't isolated from attention. They were one of the most documented families on the internet. Millions watched them, commented on them, debated their lives as if they were characters in a story. And yet, year after year, nothing happened. Until 2025. When Adult Protective Services finally stepped in and removed members of the Whitaker family, the reaction was immediate and explosive. Some people said it was long overdue. Others said it was an overreach. Many blamed the state. Many blamed outsiders. And almost everyone missed the most important part of the story. APS didn't act because the house suddenly became dirty. APS didn't act because someone finally noticed the conditions. APS acted because something changed. For a long time, the Whitakers existed in a kind of legal gray zone. Their living conditions were extreme, but they were known. They were monitored indirectly through documentaries, social media, and occasional local awareness. What the public often doesn't understand is that being poor, living differently, or even living in unsanitary conditions does not automatically trigger removal. APS doesn't intervene simply because something looks bad on camera. There has to be risk, immediate risk, documented risk. And in 2025, that risk reached a point where it could no longer be ignored. The first thing people misunderstand is timing. The Whitakers had been visible for years, but visibility is not the same as intervention. Adult Protective Services typically acts when new information comes in, not when old conditions remain unchanged. And in this case, new information came in rapidly from multiple directions over a short period of time. That matters. Before 2025, the Whitaker situation was static. The conditions were troubling but familiar. The routines were unchanged. The family dynamics, as concerning as they appeared, were consistent. APS tends to move when there is escalation, not stagnation. In early 2025, escalation began. New people entered the picture. New money started flowing. New dynamics formed inside a household that was already fragile. When outside involvement increases, so does scrutiny. And with scrutiny comes documentation. This is where many people get uncomfortable because it challenges the idea that attention always helps. As more outsiders became involved in the Whitakers' lives, more details surfaced. Financial questions, behavioral concerns, conflicting stories, promises made that didn't align with outcomes. None of these things alone would necessarily trigger APS action. But together they created a pattern. APS doesn't act on one complaint. They act on accumulation. By mid-2025, reports were no longer just about living conditions. They were about care, about supervision, about hygiene that crossed from neglect into medical risk, about individuals who could not advocate for themselves, about wounds, infections, and prolonged exposure to unsanitary environments. Those reports came from multiple sources, not just one person. That matters legally. When multiple independent reports describe similar concerns, APS is obligated to investigate. And once they investigate, they don't look at internet narratives. They look at checklists, risk assessments, medical vulnerability, capacity, guardianship status. One of the most critical turning points in this case was legal status. Several members of the Whitaker household were adults, but not all adults are considered capable under the law. APS evaluates whether a person can meet basic needs, understand medical risk, and protect themselves from harm. If the answer is no, the state has authority to intervene. In 2025, APS reportedly determined that at least some members of the household met the criteria for vulnerable adults at immediate risk. That changes everything. Another factor that cannot be ignored is documentation. For years, much of what the public saw was filtered through edited content. In 2025, unfiltered information began reaching authorities. Medical observations, environmental assessments, timelines, patterns of neglect that could be corroborated. APS does not remove people lightly. Removal is a last resort. It creates legal responsibility for the state. It costs money. It invites scrutiny. If APS steps in, it's because they believe leaving someone in place poses greater risk than removal. that threshold was crossed. It's also important to understand that APS does not operate on emotion. They don't remove people to punish families. They don't remove people because the internet is angry. They remove people because legally they believe harm is occurring or imminent. In this case, harm wasn't just theoretical anymore. There were concerns about prolonged exposure to fecal matter, concerns about untreated wounds, concerns about individuals being left without proper hygiene for extended periods, concerns about supervision and safety, and concerns about whether the household environment could realistically be stabilized quickly enough to prevent further harm. At that point, APS had two choices: leave vulnerable individuals in place and risk severe injury, infection, or death, or remove them temporarily while assessments and interventions could occur. They chose removal. This is where the narrative often turns emotional, and understandably so. Families being separated is traumatic. Even when intervention is necessary, it causes pain. But pain alone does not make an action unjustified. The key question isn't whether removal hurt. It did. The key question is whether leaving things as they were posed a greater danger. APS believed it did. Another misconception is that APS acted suddenly or secretly. In reality, removal typically follows warnings, evaluations, and attempts at remediation. Those steps are not always public. They often happen quietly through visits, conversations, and assessments that never make it online. By the time removal occurs, APS has usually concluded that voluntary compliance is unlikely or insufficient. In the Whitaker case, the speed of the final action led many to believe it was rushed. But from a legal standpoint, it was the culmination of mounting concerns, not a snap decision. There is also the uncomfortable truth that attention can accelerate intervention. When a household becomes the center of public fundraising, content creation, and competing narratives, authorities pay closer attention. Not because of fame, but because the potential for exploitation, mismanagement, and harm increases. Once money enters the picture, so does accountability. APS doesn't investigate fraud, but they do consider whether resources meant to improve care are actually doing so. When large sums are discussed publicly and conditions remain dire, questions arise. Those questions don't stay on the internet forever. They reach desks, files, caseworkers. And once that happens, the system moves. By the time APS removed members of the Whitaker family in 2025, they were no longer responding to a viral story. They were responding to what they believed was a documented pattern of neglect combined with vulnerability and risk. That doesn't mean every decision was perfect. It doesn't mean the system is flawless. It doesn't mean the outcome will automatically be better. But it does explain why the state finally acted after years of apparent inaction. Because from their perspective, this wasn't the same situation anymore. It had crossed a line. And once that line is crossed, APS doesn't ask the internet for permission. They act. In the next part, we'll break down what specifically changed in 2025 that made intervention unavoidable, and why earlier years, despite public outrage, did not meet the same legal threshold. Comment below and share what you think really pushed APS to step in when they did. To understand why 2025 became the breaking point, you have to look at what changed on the ground, not just what people saw online. For years, the Whitaker situation existed in a kind of tragic equilibrium. The conditions were bad, but they were stable. APS often views stability, even unhealthy stability, differently than rapid decline or escalation. In 2025, that stability collapsed. One of the biggest shifts was the increase in outside involvement. New people didn't just observe the Whitakers, they entered their daily lives. With that came promises of improvement, money, plans, and intervention. Ironically, those efforts raised the standard by which the situation was judged. Once resources and assistance are introduced, the expectation of change becomes real. When change doesn't happen, the question becomes why. APS pays close attention to that gap. If a household receives attention, support, and financial assistance, yet living conditions remain dangerously poor, it signals something more than poverty. It suggests an inability or unwillingness to use available resources to meet basic care needs. That distinction is critical in adult protective cases. Another key shift in 2025 was documentation quality. Earlier years were dominated by edited content and fragmented glimpses. In 2025, reports reaching APS were more detailed, specific, and consistent. They described timelines. They described duration. They described severity. Neglect isn't defined by a single dirty moment. It's defined by prolonged exposure to harm. Reports described individuals sitting for extended periods without being cleaned. Skin breakdown. Infections. Wounds that weren't treated. Odors that indicated long-term exposure, not temporary mess. These are medical red flags, not lifestyle differences. Once medical risk is identified, APS involvement becomes almost inevitable. Another critical factor was capacity. APS evaluates whether individuals can understand and manage their own care. In the Whitaker case, questions about capacity became unavoidable. Could certain individuals recognize when they were in danger? Could they advocate for themselves? Could they seek help if conditions worsened? When the answer is no, responsibility shifts to caregivers. And if caregivers are overwhelmed, incapable, or complicit in neglect, the state steps in. In 2025, APS reportedly determined that caregiving within the home was no longer sufficient to protect vulnerable adults. This doesn't mean caregivers didn't care emotionally. APS doesn't measure love. It measures outcomes. Good intentions don't stop infections. Good intentions don't clean wounds. Good intentions don't override medical risk. Another issue that escalated the situation was inconsistency in decision-making. There were moments when corrective steps appeared to be taken, followed by reversals. Promises made, then undone. Agreements reached, then ignored. From an APS standpoint, inconsistency signals instability. Stability is everything in protective services. If a household cannot maintain improvements even briefly, APS loses confidence that voluntary compliance will work long-term. Financial questions also played a role, even if indirectly. APS is not a fraud agency, but they do consider whether funds intended for care are actually improving conditions. When large sums are discussed publicly and the environment remains unchanged, it raises concern. Where did the resources go? Why didn't conditions improve? Was money mismanaged, or was the household incapable of implementing change even with support? Those questions matter because they influence whether APS believes intervention will help or simply delay harm. Another turning point was the cumulative nature of reports. APS cases don't hinge on one call. They hinge on patterns. By 2025, multiple reports described similar conditions, similar concerns, similar risks. When different sources independently describe the same problems, APS treats it as corroboration. This is often misunderstood by the public. People assume APS needs proof beyond doubt. In reality, APS needs reasonable belief of risk. And reasonable belief grows with repetition. By mid-2025, the Whitaker case file reportedly reflected a pattern that could no longer be dismissed as lifestyle difference or temporary hardship. Then there's the issue of time. Neglect cases become more urgent when conditions persist despite awareness. The longer harmful conditions continue, the greater the liability for the state if they fail to act. Once APS is aware of ongoing risk, inaction becomes dangerous for everyone involved. At that point, removal becomes less about punishment and more about protection. Another uncomfortable truth is that public attention can accelerate internal deadlines. When a case becomes widely discussed, agencies know they will be scrutinized. This doesn't mean they act for optics, but it does mean delays become harder to justify. If something goes wrong after warnings have been issued, the consequences for the agency are severe. APS is not immune to accountability. By 2025, the Whitaker situation had crossed from unfortunate to legally indefensible. Leaving vulnerable adults in a high-risk environment after documented reports would have exposed APS to serious consequences. That reality weighs heavily on decision-making. Removal is traumatic, but so is severe neglect. APS is forced to choose between two harms. In this case, they judged removal to be the lesser harm. It's also important to understand that APS removals are often temporary at first. They allow for assessment, medical care, and evaluation of long-term options. Removal doesn't automatically mean permanent separation. It means immediate risk management. Whether reunification is possible depends on what happens next. But by the time APS stepped in during 2025, they were no longer asking whether intervention was appropriate. They were asking how much longer they could wait without someone getting seriously hurt. That's the part of this story that gets lost in online arguments. The question wasn't, is this family unconventional? The question was, is this environment causing ongoing harm to people who cannot protect themselves? APS believed the answer was yes. In the next part, we'll look at how public involvement, online narratives, and competing helpers complicated the situation, and why sometimes too many people trying to help can actually make intervention more likely, not less. Comment below and share whether you think outside involvement helped or harmed the Whitakers in the long run. By the time APS stepped in, the Whitaker situation was no longer just a family matter or a social services case. It had become something far more complicated, a public spectacle layered with private suffering. And that collision between public attention and vulnerable lives is one of the most overlooked reasons intervention became unavoidable. When a family becomes widely known online, every action inside the home begins to carry weight beyond the household. Every video, every live stream, every post becomes a data point. For APS, this creates a paradox. On one hand, public visibility can bring resources and advocacy. On the other, it can expose dysfunction faster and more clearly than any caseworker visit ever could. In 2025, the Whitakers were no longer invisible. They were one of the most documented families on the internet. That documentation didn't just show moments of kindness or connection. It showed patterns. And patterns are what protective services respond to. One of the most significant complications was the number of outside actors involved. Multiple individuals entered the picture claiming to help, support, manage, advocate, or protect the family. Each brought different intentions, different plans, and different narratives. From an APS perspective, this creates instability. Protective services rely on clear lines of responsibility. Who is responsible for care? Who manages resources? Who makes decisions? Who ensures safety? In the Whitaker case, those answers became blurred. When too many people step in without clear authority or accountability, the result isn't support, it's chaos. Promises are made but not followed through. Plans overlap or contradict each other. One helper undoes what another tried to establish. APS sees this not as collaboration but as fragmentation. Fragmentation is dangerous in neglect cases. Another issue was performative care. Some help appeared to exist primarily in front of cameras. Moments of generosity, outings, gifts, and emotional support were documented and shared widely. But APS looks past presentation. They look for consistency. They ask hard questions. What happens when the camera is off? What happens overnight? What happens days later? What happens when no one is watching? In 2025, reports suggested that visible acts of help were not translating into sustained improvements in living conditions or care routines. That gap matters. Because from APS's standpoint, care that only exists intermittently doesn't reduce risk. In fact, it can increase it. Why? Because it creates the illusion of safety. Outsiders may assume someone else is handling things. Family members may rely on promised help that never fully materializes. Meanwhile, vulnerable individuals remain exposed. Another major factor was conflicting narratives. Different people speaking on behalf of the family gave different explanations for the same issues. Some minimized concerns. Others escalated them. Some blamed poverty. Others blamed individuals. Some promised imminent solutions that never arrived. For APS, inconsistency undermines credibility. If no one can agree on what the problem is, how can it be fixed? This confusion often leads APS to conclude that voluntary solutions have failed. And when voluntary solutions fail repeatedly, the state intervenes. The online environment made this worse. Social media thrives on extremes. One side framed the Whitakers as victims of systemic neglect and judgment. Another framed them as incapable or dangerous. Neither extreme helped. APS does not operate on sympathy or outrage. It operates on risk assessment. When a case becomes emotionally charged online, reports tend to increase. People who might have stayed silent feel compelled to call. Some reports may be exaggerated. Others may be accurate. APS doesn't assume truth or falsehood immediately. They look for overlap. By 2025, overlapping concerns had reached a threshold that could not be ignored. Another element was the erosion of trust within the household. When outside helpers become deeply involved, family dynamics change. Authority shifts. Long-standing routines are disrupted. Sometimes this leads to improvement. Other times, it leads to confusion and conflict. Reports suggested that internal decision-making within the Whitaker home became increasingly strained. Agreements were made under pressure. Boundaries were unclear. Some individuals resisted changes. Others didn't understand them fully. APS evaluates whether caregivers can reliably follow through on care plans. Inconsistency, resistance, or confusion can all lead to the same conclusion. The current setup cannot ensure safety. Then there's the issue of time pressure. Once APS identifies a pattern of harm, they are obligated to act within a reasonable time frame. Delay after recognition becomes liability. In 2025, the case had reached a point where continued observation without intervention would have been indefensible if harm occurred. This is something many people don't want to accept. APS doesn't wait for catastrophe. They intervene to prevent it. And prevention often looks harsh from the outside because it happens before the worst-case scenario plays out. Another uncomfortable reality is that public helpers sometimes unintentionally provide APS with more evidence. Videos meant to show improvement can also reveal neglect. Statements meant to defend can inadvertently admit problems. Live discussions can expose contradictions. In the Whitaker case, the volume of content created a detailed record of daily life. That record likely made it easier for APS to assess risk accurately. Ironically, the very attention meant to protect the family may have accelerated intervention. This doesn't mean intervention was wrong. It means the situation had reached a point where it could no longer be managed informally. Too many eyes. Too many promises. Too many unresolved risks. By the time removal occurred, APS was not reacting to a single event. They were responding to a convergence of factors. Prolonged neglect indicators. Medical risk. Questions of capacity. Inconsistent caregiving. Failed voluntary interventions. Financial ambiguity. Public documentation. Escalating reports. Any one of these alone might not have triggered removal. Together they made intervention inevitable. The hardest truth is this: APS stepping in wasn't a sudden betrayal of the family. It was the result of a slow collapse of safeguards. When families function quietly, they can sometimes survive in fragile balance for years. When that balance is disrupted by attention, money, conflict, and scrutiny, the underlying weaknesses are exposed. That's what happened here. In the final part, we'll look at what happens after APS intervention, what options remain for the family, and why the aftermath is often more complicated and more painful than the removal itself. Comment below and share your thoughts. Did public attention ultimately protect the Whitakers, or did it push a fragile situation past the point of no return? After APS intervenes, most people assume the story reaches some kind of resolution. They imagine clarity, structure, maybe even relief. But the truth is far more complicated. Removal is not an ending. It is the beginning of a long, uncertain aftermath that often creates as many questions as it answers. For the Whitaker family, APS stepping in did not suddenly fix decades of hardship. It didn't erase trauma, repair relationships, or provide instant stability. What it did was interrupt a cycle that had become unsustainable. And interruptions, even necessary ones, are painful. Once individuals are removed, the system becomes quiet by design. Privacy laws take over. Information is limited. Updates stop. For outsiders who spent years watching every moment of the Whitakers' lives, that silence feels unsettling. For the family members left behind, it can feel devastating. Betty, in particular, was left in a kind of emotional limbo. One day she was surrounded by familiar faces, chaos, and routine. The next, the house felt hollow. The people she cared for were gone, and no amount of explanation could fully bridge that loss. APS does not remove people gently in an emotional sense. They remove them decisively because hesitation creates risk. That decisiveness can look cruel from the outside, but it exists for a reason. Once the threshold for intervention is crossed, delay becomes dangerous. For those removed, the experience is often disorienting. New environments, new caregivers, new rules. Even when conditions improve materially, the emotional shock is real. Familiarity, even when unhealthy, can feel safer than the unknown. Adjustment takes time and outcomes vary widely. Some individuals stabilize and thrive. Others struggle deeply. APS cannot guarantee happiness. It can only reduce immediate risk. Another difficult reality is that intervention often fractures families permanently. Trust erodes. Guilt settles in. Blame circulates. Some family members feel betrayed. Others feel relieved. Very few feel whole. In the Whitaker case, the fractures were already present. APS did not create them, but intervention made them impossible to ignore. The public response adds another layer of complexity. Online audiences often demand accountability, apologies, villains, and heroes. They want names, explanations, and closure. But APS cases don't operate on narrative satisfaction. They operate on statutory thresholds and risk assessments. This mismatch fuels frustration. People ask, why weren't they helped sooner? Why wasn't the family supported differently? Why did it have to end this way? These are fair questions. But they are also questions without simple answers. Support systems failed the Whitakers long before 2025. Poverty, isolation, disability, and generational trauma don't appear overnight. They accumulate. And when they go unaddressed for decades, interventions become more drastic because gentler options no longer exist. Another uncomfortable truth is that once money, media, and outside helpers enter the picture, the margin for error shrinks. Mistakes that might have gone unnoticed before become magnified. Intentions are questioned. Actions are scrutinized. The system responds not only to harm but to exposure. That exposure changed everything. What remains now is uncertainty. Reunification is not guaranteed. Services take time. Evaluations take time. Healing takes even longer. Some relationships may never be restored in the same way. And for the public, the ethical question remains unresolved. Did attention help or harm? The answer is likely both. Attention brought resources, awareness, and advocacy. It also brought pressure, exploitation, and instability. It amplified voices that wanted to help and voices that wanted control. It created opportunities and risks simultaneously. The Whitakers became a symbol of poverty, of neglect, of resilience, of exploitation, depending on who was telling the story. Symbols are powerful, but they are also dehumanizing. Real people live inside them. APS intervention forced a shift from spectacle to procedure, from narrative to regulation, from public debate to private casework. That shift feels abrupt because it is, and yet it was likely unavoidable. The most sobering lesson from this story is not about blame. It's about systems. Families like the Whitakers don't fall through cracks by accident. They are missed repeatedly by design until conditions become impossible to ignore. By the time APS steps in, the system has already failed at prevention. What happens next may never be fully visible to the public. And that may be for the best. Healing rarely happens under a spotlight. Stability requires privacy. Growth requires time away from judgment. Still, the questions linger. Could things have been different if intervention came earlier? Could support have been structured more safely? Could public help have been coordinated instead of chaotic? Those questions don't just apply to the Whitakers. They apply to every vulnerable family whose pain becomes content before it becomes care. Because once a family becomes a story, it's easy to forget that stories don't bleed. People do. The Whitaker case is a reminder that attention is not the same as protection. That visibility is not the same as safety. And that good intentions are not enough when structure is missing. APS stepping in was not a triumph or a failure. It was a consequence. A consequence of years of neglect, sudden exposure, conflicting helpers, and unresolved risk. Whether the outcome ultimately leads to healing or further harm remains to be seen. What is certain is this: the moment the state intervenes, the responsibility shifts. Not just to APS, but to all of us who watched, shared, debated, and demanded answers without always considering the cost. If there is anything to take from this, it's the need for restraint, accountability, and humility when engaging with real lives online. Because once the system steps in, there is no rewind button. Only consequences. What do you think? Was APS intervention inevitable, or could this outcome have been prevented long before 2025? Share your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.